Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about from mic to mechanics lessons building an indie studio. You know, turning a creative idea into a successful studio is an adventure full of insight, experimentation, and tough lessons. So in this episode, we catch up with none other than Mustapha Price, the former Indie Game Movement producer turned studio founder, who shares what he's learned about balancing creativity with business operations and the realities of building a sustainable game studio from the ground up. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have none other than Mustapha Price on the show today. Mustapha, it is so good to have you here today, man.
Yeah, it's great to be back. It's definitely been a while.
Yes, it has been. Too long, but all for good reasons, though, right?
Yeah, big time.
And I know some of which we'll be getting into for sure. But folks, for those of you who aren't familiar with Mustapha, he is the founder and game designer of Featherfellow Games. And also, for those of you who probably recognize his voice and everything else, he's the, essentially the producer or you had the producer role for a while and stuff. I mean, you like helped pioneer this podcast with me essentially and been on it multiple times before, but in a different capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, that's true. I've helped do some interviews.
Yep.
They used to help us gather, special guests back in the day. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, the guests. You even hosted a few episodes too, where I wasn't present at all. So it's like, yeah, it's kind of weird. Oh, not weird. It feels good.
Different.
It's good, weird, different. And now you're on the other side of the mic.
Yeah.
And so please tell us though. I know a long time ago, at some point, you gave us some updates or shared a little bit of your activity, but essentially, what is Featherfellow Games? And please share us a little bit more about that and kind of your role with that studio.
Yeah. What isn't Featherfellow Games? Because to be honest with you, I mean, we're a team of 3 friends, based out of New Hampshire. We incorporated like 6 years ago, but I would say really in the last few years, we kind of hit our stride and we're like, you know what? We can come together and make games kind of under the banner. So Featherfellows in and of itself is wordplay on the term wingman. And so,
Yep.
It's like a distinguished gentleman version of the same idea of like having people's back and introducing them into situations where they can be social and connect with others. And so we've kind of put our focus lately into creating kind of tabletop experiences that are intended to be kind of casual and fun, maybe not necessarily party games, but certainly social games or games with a lot of social elements.
Awesome. Love that. And I know we'll get into it more, but you incorporated as you mentioned, but you're currently and still developing your first let's say working on your first project and everything, and we're going to get into that more too. So all exciting stuff. And well, let me ask you, because I know that you've had a lot going on between that and other things, still have a full-time job stuff. So when you're not so busy doing all those things, what do you do to unplug, man?
What do I do to unplug? I know it drives people in game dev crazy when you give this answer, but it's still games for me. I'm fortunate because of the way my time is divided that I still am not necessarily as jaded on just the playing games experience. So I don't mind kicking my feet up with a game if I find myself with a few extra minutes.
Yeah, nice. So it's definitely gaming straight up.
Yeah, and then also I I don't know if this is classified as more work, but I'm a writer. That's, kind of my first love, and so I spend a lot of time when I have free time writing either like essays, like reviews of entertainment, or even fiction. So,
Awesome. Absolutely love it. Well, hey, thanks for sharing that. And,
thanks for asking.
of course, of course. And well, in light of that though, too, we want to get to know you a little bit better. And I think actually this is kind of funny only because all right, yes, I am leading up to the Q box round, folks, but the reason why I find this a little funny is because I remember so many conversations that were primarily probably prompted by me about, oh, it'd be really cool if we could put ourselves in the Q box round.
Yeah.
I feel a little left out that I always get to ask everybody else.
hmm
But now you are the one who is going to be in the Q box round. So how,
Yeah.
maybe I know you're ready, but how do you feel about this?
Andrew, I remember I came up with some of these questions, so I think I'm ready to go.
Yeah,
I
right.
can handle it.
Awesome. All right, the first one here is what's the most helpful or impactful advice you ever received?
Yeah, man, that's a loaded question for me because I really like to think about what do I consider advice? Is it something somebody is giving just from the perspective of wanting you to know or improve or learn something, or is it just like perspective that you get kind of through osmosis over time? I think there's an element of that too. I think to kind of keep in theme, leading up to this interview, I've been thinking a lot about some of the advice I've heard here on this show, in terms of like the brilliant people we've had on the networking panels that we've done at PAX each year.
Yep.
I think a lot about the intentionality and empathy, which I know is something that you lead with a lot of the times in your work. I even think about like one of my favorite interviews we did was with Greg Kasavin from Supergiant.
Yep.
And his advice was about advice and how to determine what feedback is useful, and really kind of pinpointing the place of origin for what someone's saying, and leveraging that. So it's a lot of talking to say I don't necessarily have one distinct piece, but I think it's an aggregate of things learned over a lot of people's experience. But if I could prioritize any one, I guess I would say, leading with empathy, being decent to people. I think the rest follows.
Awesome. I really like that take too because it's a hard answer, I think, from where you're coming from, and I feel that same way a lot too. Where sometimes it's that process of being reflective and understanding like the question as a whole, like what is advice, right? And yes, it's always great and helpful in those little moments, like where it's like this one phrase that's, let's say, a guiding principle, right? But then on the flip side of that, there's this other aspect that's really, I think, difficult to pinpoint, to even articulate in some cases. And as you said it so succinctly, it's really this accumulation of different things that have led you. It's like I can't really give credit necessarily to one thing, at least from your perspective. And I think that's so true in a lot of what we do too. And I bet you even in the past, a lot of guests, even though they give us a very specific answer, it's accumulation of other things too.
Yeah.
It's just a one key thing that they might identify quick, obviously for the format and purpose of the show. But
Sure.
I really, really like that answer too, because I don't think that type of approach really gets thought about too much. And taking a moment to really reflect on those things, I think is important. So I'm really glad you gave that answer. And yeah, and of course it wasn't like, I'm sorry, I don't know anything to provide here. It was, I think, a lot more valuable than that. So, all right. Sorry, folks. I digress a bit there. But all right. Next is, what's your biggest gaming pet peeve?
Oh man. So I've got a couple. Like I hate escort missions. I don't like waiting, but
Who does?
I think my biggest one is when I play a lot of like narrative driven games, mainly like JRPGs and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I really don't like when you win in the battle, but then you lose in the cutscene. It's like, oh, turns out the guy was too strong or whatever the case might be. I just feel like there are some creative ways to convey those insurmountable odds through the mechanics. So that way I feel like I'm losing the fight in the gameplay, even if I'm doing everything correctly.
Oh, yeah, I could totally see that. Those are some good ones there then. And then next and not least, and obviously, the staple here on the show is what game are you playing now?
Yeah, I'm bouncing back and forth. So I got the like true ending in Hades 2. And so now I'm kind of just going back and doing like challenge runs because they're nice and shorter because I die a lot. But then there's also on the Switch 2, there's like the remastered Mario Galaxy 2. And so
Okay.
I've been revisiting that as well as kind of like a childhood favorite of mine.
Yeah, I have a quick follow-up question to that for Mario Galaxy 2. Now that you're revisiting it, I'm sure. Where is your stance now that compared to Mario Galaxy 1?
Oh, Galaxy 1's always been my favorite of the two. I think it just is a better game in terms of how it tells its story through its mechanics. And yeah, I love Galaxy 2. I think it's a very well crafted game, but it just doesn't hit the same marks for me. It feels very close to like traditional Mario, where the first Mario Galaxy had this kind of like profound like quietude to it that I really liked.
Yeah, it's more like an extension than anything else. Like there's not much. You're right on that narrative element. There's not much else too much there, but you still have like it's like DLC, but not.
Kind of, sort of, yeah.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all that with us. And now let's get to our conversation. Shortened version is, as I'm led in with the intro, is lessons building an indie studio. But yes, of course, from Mike to mechanics. So to kick things off with you, bud, and we kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I still kind of want your take a little bit. It's been a while since you've been, on the show. But now that you're running your own studio, what's been the biggest surprise about kind of turning, a creative project and kind of into a full-fledged business? Because back when you were on the show, it was kind of this creative thing, like on the side, you and your friends, and then it has over the years really been into, like you said, you incorporated 6 years back, and your guys are going strong. How has that process been like for you?
Yeah, no, I mean that's so first of all, and I guess this could be the first lesson. When given the opportunity to introduce yourself, you should probably also talk about the game you're working on. So, our game is also called Feather Fellows. If you go on the website, it's got some like outdated assets. We're working on getting those swapped out. But the name of the game is Feather Fellows. It is a kind of deck building card battler, but like much simpler. So akin to like, I think of like something like Hearthstone Battlegrounds or something like that, but in a physical tabletop space with like smaller numbers. It's intended to be a little bit more casual friendly, and it's bird themed. That's just to provide the context for the answer to your question about like the process of getting more serious with it, right? Because it was something where we started with index cards, with abilities written on them, or like stock art images and things like that, and just kind of an idea that we were playing around with. It was actually something Bobby, one of the founders, put together like a prototype and brought it to us. It must have had like 4 or 5 cards in it, and we played it and we were like, you know what, this is really fun. And so we did that for like 6 months as like maybe we go back to this eventually. We were at the time kind of consumed with a different project that for the time being has been put on hold. The biggest kind of hurdle is that when you get in a room with 2 of your best buds and maybe you're having drinks and that's how you start, as the business, it is a huge collection of, wouldn't it be cool if we did this? Imagine this possibility,
Yeah.
And you kind of forget every lesson you ever learned about like scope and how to create something that is like manageable, and not only manageable in the sense of like, right, we're all guys with full-time day jobs, so there is a limit to what we physically can do. But also, when you're starting out, you know, simplifying your scope helps you to ensure that you're not like biting off more than you can chew mechanically.
Mm.
Um, you know, I'm rambling a bit, but to in terms of the surprise, I think it's really how you have to like leverage the strengths and weaknesses of those with you, because we definitely have those moments where it was like we can do everything under the sun, and some killjoy has to be the one to be like, no, actually, we should ground this in something. We should set ourselves to maybe more strict of a schedule. We should set ourselves to like, this is the maximum number of like unique mechanics we're going to allow to exist in the game just for its ease of access, you know.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and it seems obvious. And I think to me, it was a little bit because I have, my education background is in game design. It's that aspect of like, at some point the fun in games has to end, and you have to be, I think, process minded and business minded at the same time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You make a great point because what you just described to me sounds like it's like it was like all of us I think have this moment to some degree, regardless of who it's shared with or not. And it's like, oh, wouldn't it be fun to do this? And it's that really, it's all like passion driven and creativity and in that aspect and really exploring it. And then so over time though, what you're just describing was really balancing that creative side. So as I got further into it, which you just led up to, what did it then look like in terms of shaping the responsibilities of running the studio? I mean, you mentioned yourself, you have that background, educational background in game design.
Hmm.
Was it the same with the others, or was it diverse? And regardless of the specifics of it, like how did you guys start kind of like determining how your roles play into the project and the business?
Yeah. Man, the different roles, that was tough to pin down early, because like I did come in with that experience. I worked on some past like student projects and things like that. And even just like my exposure to developers through my work with you, I feel like I came in with kind of the most established experience and knowledge of the industry, and a lot of what we were getting into. And I think even that was a little bit removed because my background has been really more video games and when we were going into tabletop.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think some things started to kind of take shape themselves just based on our experience, because it was pretty diverse. Like one of our guys, his background is software development, and one of them is more of like business, legal, that sort of thing. And then we were all still, because a startup of three people, everybody's doing a little bit of everything.
Yep.
You've got that design aspect, understanding how we're going to market, which I know we'll get to later. That's going to be a bear to discuss, because that's been a whirlwind. But it really kind of came to like, if there is something you excel at, like you have to grab it, because realistically, we're not going to go beyond the three of us. Like, we don't want to be outsourcing or spending money we don't have, right? As three people kind of bootstrapping our own project. And in terms of like how we got to the point where it was like putting kind of constraints on the game to make it, battle ready, so to speak, I think I was probably a pretty big driver of that. To be honest with you, I got to a point about a year in where I was saying to them, like, I feel like at present, the game is lacking something that gives it like a really strong hook and
Mm-hmm.
identity. I think it was at the time, it was all about the cards. And I was like, well, the way you interact with them, I think has to change. Like we need to something where someone picks this up and says, okay, this is the aspect of my experience that is going to make every single game different. And so we started designing like unique hero cards with specific abilities. Like, think kind of like a hero in Hearthstone or like a commander in Magic the Gathering, where it's like these guys have like unique properties that engage with the core mechanics of the game in different ways. And that was where we were like, okay, this is our thing. We can take this very far. and that was like gasoline, and we've been pretty accelerated ever since.
Awesome. So like I love how you describe that process too, because it's essentially it takes some like, exploration, but in part of that through that process too, it's about like as you said, like, hey, we really need to kind of like ground ourselves a bit, but also like play to our strengths and stuff. I mean, you and I both know very well these are very common things that we've talked about in the show before too.
Mhm.
But I mean, it's somewhat interesting too when you realize like you're applying some of these things, whether learned from this podcast or elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
And it's like you're putting those learnings on your yourself, like you're pointing the lens
Yeah.
on yourself. And I mean, I know this is a little off topic in terms of what we've prepared here today, but how has that felt like in itself? Because I know what it's been for me in some cases, but how was it for you in that case?
Oh man, I feel like the biggest hypocrite in the world because and I think like everybody to an extent, like if you have any interest in making games, you can probably relate to this, right? How many times a day do you have the man, wouldn't it be cool moment, right? Like
Yeah.
the passion that drives us to make ideas is a very important part because if you don't actually care about the why of why you're doing it, like you're not going to make something that resonates with people. Like games are art, and art intrinsically has to come from a person and has to come from a person's drive, but also having an idea is literally the easiest part of the entire process.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, get to that point and they're sitting in like the room talking about the ideas and they're like, this is the game design. And it's like, well, no, it's not. This is like probably 10% of designing the game.
Yep.
So it's having to have the discipline to be like, these are things that like not only have I learned, these are things that have been told to me by like, you know, we were interviewing Game of the Year nominees. I would be stupid not to take their advice to heart, right? Like that's significant. And I think there's that challenge of getting over the hurdle of like being the passionate, being the artist, and being like, no, there is a discipline and a functionality required to make this work. You
Oh
know?
yeah, yeah. And actually, I had a very similar moment recently where I was doing a lot of. I'll be straightforward with that. I was doing a lot of activity, even like probably not too long ago, past episodes I mentioned this, but doing a lot of activity on LinkedIn, and then to a point where like one of the posts I made got like over 100,000 impressions, and this is all great and stuff. But then I later laid out current activities and plans that I was working on with a mentor of mine. And then the thing that came up, he's like, "Hey, all this LinkedIn stuff sounds great, but what is it really doing for you? Like you, like oh, I'm like, well, currently I'm not really. I just maintaining my presence is what really my answer was. He's like,
Hmm.
okay, but how important is that for your objectives? I'm like, well, it's not really important at all. He's like, then don't do it. And it's like,
Yeah.
and then it was funny because he's like, you're doing all this work for it to going somewhere that doesn't necessarily have an impact in the direction you're looking to go. And then I thought
Yeah.
for a moment, it was like, what's funny? Like in the years I've been doing marketing from B2B stuff and everything else, that's the one piece of advice that has been almost ingrained into my system, but apparently not, because I would tell that to other clients
Yeah.
and customers and all sorts of people like, don't do all this work if you're paying for it and it's not in some type of resource or something, that time, bandwidth, whatever, and then it's going to amount to nothing because you didn't have a plan for it or it wasn't well organized or anything else. And here I am doing that same thing. And years later, when I should know this by like definitely by now, but we're still like our own worst enemy sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, when you're talking about these things in theory, right? Like it's a completely different thing to be in the practice of doing it. You don't even necessarily realize that that's what you're
Yeah.
doing until you have the moment to kind of pull back and reflect a little bit.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, I love that you share that too, because I like I said, I experience this, and I'm sure we all do, right? We can be it's not so much as like there's something wrong with us as creators and people on our own journeys and stuff. I think it's more of you're always going to be in a better position when you're kind of removed from the situation a little
Hmm.
bit. Like my roles as a consultant,
Yeah.
you be advising like other people in the industry, friends, whatever the case may be.
Hmm.
But when it's you, it gets so much harder to put that perspective on yourself and look at it as objectively as you can possible. It can be done, but it's still a
Yeah.
challenge. And hence why I'm grateful for having a mentor that was able to help with that, or at least, or consider other people for that advice, because that we need that as I think human beings,
Hmm.
because otherwise
Yeah.
we're still gonna maybe again self-sabotage, even though we have no intention of doing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or it could go that way. You know, anyways, with getting back to you now, you talked about these roles, responsibilities, and even got into some of like the realizations you guys had with the project, different directions and stuff. At some point, you started to obviously play test. You guys did a lot yourselves, and then I know to some capacity, let's say more public play testing. When it came to that round of things, it's like, again, this is relating to feedback. Like, what kind of notes, information that you were getting that you decided was worth acting on, not just noise, and also based off of your own experiences and realizations with the project.
Yeah. I had a catchphrase through development that it's not a problem unless it's a pattern.
Okay.
And that was to say, like, the other guys, they come from card games where big balance outliers are incredibly problematic because people will latch onto them and that will become like the main play style in a season or something. But in our game, my hope was, yeah, maybe at the like top of the game's skill ceiling, there are combos you can do and things that might be deemed not the most balanced, but that the average player within our target audience does not do those things or does not want for those things because they are more complicated than the target audience we're aiming for.
Mm.
And so the most valuable feedback wasn't things people said, it was things they did. A lot of the time, the way we facilitated playtests, because it was tabletop, is we would hand them the rules, hand them the game, say, play the game,
Yep.
like set it up yourself, go through the whole process. And there were little things that we found along the way, like in the game, you have to play every card in your hand every turn. If you play a card for gold that you accrue within a turn has to be spent in that turn or it goes away. A lot of the time, we found people were thinking that the gold stayed in their inventory throughout the entire game. And that was partially a balanced decision, but it was more so we wanted fewer things for people to keep track of.
Mm.
And so if we saw stuff like that, people doing something incorrect with a resource or playing a card in a way that it wasn't intended, that was where we were like, okay, this is really good feedback, not necessarily because it encourages us to change a rule, but because it invites us to make sure that this is better outlined in the rules.
Interesting.
Um, so it was definitely a different kind of. I would say we were pretty painstaking about the balance. So fortunately, like that part of the process was surprisingly easy. I think we had the wherewithal to kind of be like, even just in testing amongst the three of us, sometimes if something was a balance outlier in a way that we felt was significant, it became very apparent very quickly. So yeah, so it was a lot more about like player behaviors and how to best communicate the game rules.
Okay. So would you say then, based off of any of this insight that you got, was there ever a point where it dramatically changed the direction of the project, or is it really just about refinement?
There was one pretty significant change that came about from feedback. It was to do with like how we handled life totals, and honestly, that wasn't because it that wasn't a power level thing. It was a playtime issue. It would yeah, it was a situation where a lot of the time players who were newer would do these like turtling strategies where they try to give themselves as much health as possible. And it didn't necessarily make them stronger, but it did typically add about 20 to 30 minutes onto the average
Ah,
game.
yep.
And so that was more of like, okay, here's some significant changes we can make. That's the other thing about feedback that I would say was really important was that a lot of the times it wasn't necessarily just about fair or unfair, right? Like there were things that you could say maybe were more objectively fair, but if they created like a bad play experience, you could tell. You could see the look on somebody's face when they felt like they'd been doing the right thing or doing what the game encourages them to, and they are punished for it, right?
Ah,
So
okay.
so so things like that are where you step in with maybe the game design is also as much an art as it is a science,
Yep.
and kind of interpret like, is the vast majority of response to this going to be negative, even if it makes sense, on a spreadsheet?
Yeah. You know what? I think that's a really interesting take because I feel like we haven't really that hasn't necessarily surfaced. I'm sure to some degree it has on the show here before, that particular note where it's like you're building something up to a point where it feels like it's intended, it's right, it's probably almost even motivating or empowering, but then you get to this one aspect or further down, you're like, oh crap. And I think the only example I can think of this that I don't think I ever mentioned on the show is through some of my work and research is in management games, right? Where let's say you're trying to have this like management system and everything else, and it feels really good. And then up to a certain point, you realize, oh, I messed up. And now all my
Hmm.
work was for nothing. And there's
Hmm.
no like mechanic or thing to maybe kind of reduce that blow. Because for at least in some of these games I was analyzing, and then what was happening was people are like, oh, I wasted all that time. And then the replayability factor now becomes like you were saying, it's that negative experience. It's gonna be that much harder than people to get back into the game and playing again.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fortunate that like I said before, I'm a writer and I'm formally trained. I have an MFA, and so I've done a lot of workshopping for like novel writing over the years. And there are times where you are writing Act Three, and if there's something that's not hitting, it sometimes means you have to throw away your first like 50 pages and start them over.
Yep.
And so that is a process I am very used to. The challenge is going to two of your close friends and saying, "Hey guys, actually everything we just spent the last, 2 weeks on, I have found this one little thing in it that means we probably can't do it." I
Yeah.
think you have a little bit more freedom. Things are a little bit less built on top of each other, I find, in tabletop, where like thankfully making one small change, it's not like you're tweaking something in like a character controller in a video game where like all of a sudden the way that character interacts with everything is like irreparably changed. I think you have a little bit more freedom to kind of like Jenga pull out pieces individually in a board game and replace them,
Yep.
you know. But yeah, it can be a little bit tough. And then also like this probably comes as no surprise, right? You have three people in a room who are passionate about what they're working on. There are going to be things people hold on to,
Yes. Yep.
like ideas that they're like, I love it so much. It was part of the thing that got me excited about the project. And then looking at it from a bird's eye view, no pun intended, I see it just plain doesn't work, and that sucks. It hurts.
Yeah. And it's interesting you say that too because I'm sure for some people listening, that are let's say solo devs, I don't know what's more challenging, right? Like you
Hmm.
making that realization yourself, or you working with a co-founder or co-founders, in your case, where it's like now it's like, how do I convince this person in the most meaningful, objective way to move on? And I think as I'm saying this, what came to mind is like this is why in the past when I think we have had a lawyer, and when they talk about like, I know I'm getting a little bit more technical here, but when you're talking about like kind of like writing out like what's a working agreement and identifying these core principles in terms of essentially objectives to follow in the event that there are some like disagreements or someone's really attached to something, right? That and even doing this for yourself, I think as an individual is important too, because it's like that's why some of these foundational things is what is a core objective that you guys have as a studio or that you have
Hmm.
for making this project and whatever else, because then you can go back to that and have a hard conversation with other people or yourself in making those calls because they will
Yeah.
come up. Then they do. And you gave a perfect example of that too, where, hey, people will feel attached to these things, but what is the right call for, your studio essentially or the project?
Yeah. One thing that you brought that up, and it reminded me of something kind of anecdotally about the game that I think was like a really difficult hurdle for us. So obviously, as I said, we're three close friends, and all of our wives are also friends. All of us, we hang out all the time, and all three of them, our spouses have been very, very supportive in the game, in the development process. But when we first started out, it was a much simpler game. And so for the ones who didn't really play games as much, they would still show up and play it with us and test it out. And I think as we kind of introduced some more mechanics, there was like a moment where it was like the support never went away, but their vested interest in the game on like a game experience level changed because all of a sudden our audience did become somewhat more of a seasoned card game player, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
there was like it was this like personal like difficult thing of like, man, like your our best friends are now maybe a little bit alienated by the choices we're making. Are we going in the wrong direction? And it was an emotional choice even to be like, no, this is the thing that ultimately serves the game the best. This is the thing that when we get into the conversation of marketing, distribution, you know, the thing that gives you maybe a standout position on a shelf, I think, are some of the hardest choices we made, and choices that ultimately like meant that maybe some people in our immediate social circle wouldn't be as invested in it as maybe people who were a little bit more in the tabletop gaming space.
I love that you called out that transition because as you were saying it, I'm like, man, that's probably one of the biggest things in the industry, at least from the indie scape,
Hmm.
that a lot of us struggle with is that realization when we move from that passion and emotional connection to the marketability and what's catering to the audiences, and it's making essentially that jump. I would say it's more of a leap in some cases, and really identifying that. And like, I don't know, you talking about that just now and what you guys realized was such like created such a really interesting like vision for me, or I could visualize it pretty well. And I'm just, especially in the work that I do and what I've seen people struggle with in these spaces, and it's just really interesting. But I think that's a key realization we all maybe need to identify and face at some point if we haven't already. But it's not, I don't think it's going to change too much with each iteration or future projects either, right? I mean, I
Hmm.
think you'll be a little bit more keen to it or in tune to that, but I think it will still be a similar process that you outlined, which
Hmm.
I think is
Yeah.
really important because we don't think about it too much until it's like it's almost like a coming of age moment, but you don't know
Hmm.
exactly when it will arrive.
Yeah, no, that's such a good way to put it because it really comes down to like what is the difference between an idea and a product, and the thing about ideas is that everybody has them. Execution is everything.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is being able to say, okay, what am I holding on to because I feel like it is supposed to be that way because that's the idea that I had, versus like what is the best shot that this thing has while still maintaining the identity of my original vision. It's push and pull, it's give and take, which feels silly to even say doing like a tabletop game post pandemic in the first place, but it is still like, how do you give yourself the best possible odds,
Yeah.
in what is still going to be to some extent a lottery.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. And in light of that transition too, I'd love to kind of now dive into the marketing side because you're calling out to that. It's like through that realization, it's like, hey, we have an audience, we identify them, we're getting this feedback, we're really tailoring this product, this game, for this because hey, we identify this as gonna give us the best shot possible. So when now we're seeing this way, we're shifting maybe our approach a little bit, when we get into things, and and yes, this is going to differ a little bit from probably a majority of people listening, but still very applicable. when we're getting into the concepts and ideas as visibility and distribution and how tricky that can be. You guys, like, how are you approaching this challenge right now?
Yeah, man. So I have been affectionately referring to it as Pandora's box, in that I am very particular about when we open it, because the thing about the trust and the goodwill, right? Being a small business, having your community around you, is that can very quickly go away if you're offering things and not delivering. You
Mm-hmm.
know, we are at the stage of the process where we are in like final conversations, not even final conversations. We're like getting files uploaded to our manufacturer. So we're hoping to have like our pre-production first like copy of the game within the next couple of months. But we want to have the understanding of lead times and all the technical aspect of like when will we have games in hand, and when will we have our storefront up, and when will we be able to deliver on units as quickly as possible. But I think there's the other aspect, and I touched on some of this earlier, which is how do you balance being the studio with like maybe some of the hobbyist aspects as well, where we are still guys with full-time jobs. You know, we don't necessarily, we have a limited amount of bandwidth and time, you know, and we kind of had the conversation up front of like, what are the things that like for the stage of life we're at that we're not going to want to sacrifice, right? Like,
Mm.
you know, maybe late nights and impromptu meetings are easy now, but like for those of us who, you know, starting or growing families or things like that, like how do we strike the balance? And so I know this all sounds like out of the scope of marketing, but believe me, when marketing comes up, it's the first thing I think of is like, I don't want to do this halfway, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Um, but in terms of some of the more tangible things I've been doing in the hopes of, or we've been doing as a team, but I would say in particular as a result of our work together have been top of mind for me. A lot of the game, the the bird theme in and of itself is intended to evoke this kind of like comedic element, but we've really prioritized having very strong iconography. We've got like our logo for our company is like this blue jay character who is also present in the game. We've done a very distinct visual style for all of the heroes so that they are both like evocative of what they do from a game design perspective, but also somebody could look at one and be like, man, I'm kind of curious about like how this came about or what this character is, you
Nice.
know. So creating assets that can be leveraged to kind of further the conversation about the game outside of just its gameplay has been a really big way that we've hoped to prepare ourselves for those big marketing pushes. And then also just conversations about like, how do we leverage our size? How do we leverage what we represent in our community? I think some of that is like engaging with some of the local game stores, trying to offer that like, yeah, because people like supporting local small businesses when it's accessible for them to do so, you know.
Yep. Yeah, that's a very good point too, because it's like there's two ways, right? There's a local aspect that you just called out to,
Mhm.
and people like supporting that, but it has to be accessible. And sometimes that I think that concept of being accessible also relates to when sometimes you hear, "Oh, make yourself look bigger than you are," right? Because
Mhm.
that could be perceived. I'm looking at this very differently here, folks, but that could be perceived as a means of accessibility. Because if you look or appear too small, that may give the signal, oh, it might not be accessible. And
Mhm.
again, I'm being somewhat abstract here. So if it
Yeah,
doesn't
that's
articulate,
right.
that's for some people, it's okay. But then so there's that. But then like, I think it's a really interesting, uh, like thing that you guys are discovering here and acknowledging. The other thing I want to say, go back to, so I can at least quickly translate into video games. You were
Mhm.
talking about the assets, the iconology, or whatever the term that you used, and everything from in-game all the way into, some of the, let's say, other art assets that could be used for promotional purposes and stuff.
Yeah.
What you're saying is no different than like identifying key art or what kind of things that you
Mhm.
could share on like social media and things like that, right? But what is that signal, and how do you align it all the way down into the in-game experience? And I
Hmm.
love that you called out that you guys, even as a tabletop, card game, that you have thought that much through, because essentially what you're doing is identifying not just the identity as a whole too, but also the alignment aspect of it, which I think is really good. And sometimes, again, when we listen to folks like Chris Zukowski talking about, hey, your key art is so important and stuff, and here and you are outlining in a more detailed way, but also in a different way because it's a different type of product. The same thing, but just calling out too that this is essentially we're thinking about alignment and how it's perceived and how this could help really make that connection resonate and work with our marketing all the way down to the in-game experience.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we're card games, so I'm constantly thinking about other card games and,
Oh, I bet.
you know, think Balatro, right?
Yep.
Like simplest like idea visually that you can imagine, right? It's just like a very simple like screen layout, but they go hard into, you know, the the like VHS like filter, the like audio, the way the Jokers look,
Yep.
like all of that, it takes this game that like if you would not think something like Balatro would have such a strong aesthetic identity in the way that it does, or like Slay the Spire, where its
Yep.
mechanics really speak for itself, but still like you have people who want to know about the lore and the details and the world around the gameplay experience. And I think that's something we really put a lot of consideration into. And I think it even works on a different level because humor was always also
Yep.
at the top of mind, because we want people at the end of the day, like, this isn't the game where you try to find the optimal line and the best possible combo every single time. I want it to be the game where the first time you read a card and see what it does, you maybe giggle a little bit. You're like, that's
Yeah.
silly,
Yeah. Yeah.
like that. That's what we're going for, and I think you can really endear people that way. I mean, we'll see, but I'm excited for once we open Pandora's box. I think the people who do engage with the game are going to find a very strong identity within it, and so
Yeah.
that's kind of the most preparation we can do with the bandwidth we currently have.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I really like that example you provided too. With Slay the Spire and Bill Outro in terms of the range, but still how identity can totally be a part of either of those. Well, we just probably don't think about it as such. One is being much simpler than the other. One has no lore where the other does. But either so, the identity can still create this. I don't know, entity or thing that is still inviting and encouraging of others to to learn more about it. But that doesn't always mean diving into lore either, right? But
Hmm.
a
Yeah.
great example there.
Right. I mean, I would say those two games to me are much more similar than they are different, and I think people don't really think of them that way. And I think the identity is a big part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of identity and getting out there and stuff, and I know you alluded to this in terms of calling it Pandora's box. I mean, but what role up to this point has marketing played so far? Like, I mean, what are you guys thinking right now about how you're going to build awareness before launch?
Yeah. I mean, we learned some hard lessons. I think there was times where we thought maybe a year and a half ago, all right, we're primed. This is it. We're going to be within the next few months having this thing out there. And I think a lot of the times when you're dealing with like mass production, there are lessons you learn that are like, no, this is going to set you back some, you know, time, cost, all of that. And the last thing we ever want to do is be building awareness around a game where the launch is in and of itself a question mark.
Yeah.
I think we are finally at the point where it's like we know we have a manufacturer that's working with us. We have budget for our first round of units, but it's all bootstrapped. And so the pacing, the timetable on all of it has had to this entire time be pretty by the seat of our pants, you
Mm.
know. And so in that regard, it's a very careful, very meticulous calculation. that is going into like, when do we start to have that conversation? Of course, the ideal is before launch. Build awareness, build up some hype around it, is the ideal. But also making sure that we're not over promising so that we don't under deliver in terms of like lead times and stuff.
Oh yeah, that's one model I follow all the time in everything I do. Are we, can we under promise and over deliver?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's the opposite, that's where expectations fall, and essentially you can degrade or eliminate any trust that you've already established too.
Right.
And that's such a huge important part. Let me ask you this straight out though: have you guys been doing any marketing in any capacity at all?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing a little bit of social media stuff here and there. The website has also like I've been adding like little like story tidbits for each of the like hero cards in the game, stuff
Very
like
cool.
that. But it's been very light, very light. We also did like, some like branding videos for the company itself, things like that. And but yeah, it's been I mean, right? I've been fortunate enough to be kind of on some stages and some full houses at PAX, right? And even then, with that being kind of the dream situation, my approach has been to be very measured about how much I share, because the idea is I'm a big planner. It definitely it bears out in every aspect of my life. Like, I don't even like saying let's get together Saturday. I need to know like what time, you know,
Yeah.
before I commit to it. Like, that's just the way I've always worked. And so saying this game is coming at this indefinite point in time is a difficult thing for me. I wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah. No, and honestly, I think your what you shared is probably something that a lot of us feel too. Even though we have this doubt, it's just like it's almost like I don't know, and I don't want to just call out, say it, or speak on your case, but I think there's just some level of fear that whether we acknowledge it or not, it's
Hmm.
still there. It lingers and it's there because it's the unknown of like what else, what needs to be done, even if it to a degree is known of what you need to be
Yeah.
done. There's
And let
still
me
that
be very
uncertainty.
clear, right? Like, none of this, and I'm not like naive about the state of the industry, but I none of this is fear that the game doesn't speak for itself. Like I feel very, very pleased with what we've done, but I think there is an aspect of it that's like we're dealing with, uncertain market conditions because we are importing ours, so it's going to be, there are going to be tariffs and elements like that, which I don't think will create delays for us. But then there are also um, aspects of it of like, what happens if you get a mass manufactured copy of it and it looks wrong in some way? That from what I've learned about the graphic design processes they employ, that could set you back a couple months. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It doesn't mean we're not going to get to the product we want, but it does mean that we have to be prepared for, you know, maybe our ideal is January, February. We could be talking about this time next year, depending on what
Yeah,
happens, right?
yeah, exactly.
I don't think that will be the case, but I want to be prepared for it,
Yeah,
you know?
so it's almost like being prepared for the unknown
Hmm.
to a degree, right? Because you can't
Yeah.
also go on hyper extreme with the what if game, is what I like to
Yeah.
call it.
Yeah.
Because then you're just great. You're preparing for all these things, but if only like let's say you prepare for what if 20 things happen and you
Yeah.
do all that work and only two of them happen.
Yeah.
Well, that's opportunity cost right there, as far as I'm
Yeah.
concerned.
Yeah. That's a valid point.
So, and one last quick question: Are you guys doing a Kickstarter at all, or thinking about it, or has that come up at all in conversation?
It did come up in conversation. I think we were really passionate about doing what we could as far as bootstrapping the project ourselves,
Mhm.
just due to like schedule constraints and things with our full-time jobs and stuff. I know I've been around enough Kickstarters to know that that in and of itself is also kind of a full-time commitment,
Yes.
you know. Through like I was a student of Neil Lorenza back when Bacon Man was on
Yep.
Kickstarter,
Neil was
you
on
know.
the episode. I think. at least twice, possibly. Anyways,
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, um, I feel very strongly about like knowing our limits, and I think that's why we've kind of had this like very slow burn, right? It's not that we've been, I would say, the making the game part is, as I said earlier, it's the easy part, right?
Yeah,
Like the rest of it is like knowing your market conditions, knowing your costs is huge. And sometimes if you don't have necessarily the financial backing or the funding, that cost comes in other places. Like you pay it in time,
exactly.
it means you have to maybe grind a little bit slower to get things to where they need to be. And I think we've kind of had the best of both worlds, right? Like we're all great friends making a game together. And then also, we haven't necessarily had to make some of the sacrifices that people who go all in do, And that's not to say those things are off the table. If we reach an opportunity where it's like, hey, you know what? Maybe it would be prudent for us to go faster, and maybe there's opportunity to be had here. But I think for me, it's what do I wear as the point of pride is like going through the experience start to finish, and especially like kind of getting to see the publishing side of it
Yeah,
all on our own without accepting any outside help.
yeah,
You know?
yeah. There's valid to be learned in that process too. And I know there's other takes and perspectives. On the flip side, there's also there's value, but there's also that potential cost. But again,
Yeah.
I think the landscape, at least from a tabletop perspective, can be a little bit different from video games. But I don't know. I'm just simply being neutral in the manner
Yeah. No.
from
No. I
everything
appreciate it.
I've heard, because I always see it as both sides. But again, it's a matter of perspective, and I think it's also a matter not just of different perspectives. It's a matter of your own personal perspective in terms of
Hmm.
what are you confident in yourselves and your team and everything else on what you can deliver and what you want to get out of that whole experience.
Yeah.
I think that's really where the value comes in versus what everybody else is telling you. Kind of going back to our taking
Yeah.
advice.
And to the point you just made about like, yeah, the thing that I would say is that none of what I'm offering is like this is the way you should do this. What I am saying is like this is the way we did it. And here are the things that I would say so far have worked, and here are the things that for us have not, or maybe like in hindsight I would do differently. But I think the thing that you mentioned advice and the value of advice, and I go back to what we talked about in that Hades interview back in like 2020.
Yeah.
You know, the usefulness of the advice is really in a theoretical sense. But once you kind of get in there and start doing things practically, you're going to live probably a very different experience, and there are going to be things where we talked about the moments where you realize I'm not following my own advice, where maybe
Yeah.
that can be a pitfall, as well as moments where you're like, this is advice I've gotten from every game design podcast, every experience I've ever had. And in this particular instance, I have the opportunity to do something completely the opposite, and that might be correct. It's all about hedging your bets and managing risks.
Yeah. I think a way I'll summarize kind of what you just said there too. It's not necessarily about what advice you take. It's what you consider and how you apply it in your particular instance and
Yeah,
situation. Because otherwise, it's all anecdotal, right?
yeah, exactly.
So, well, I absolutely have loved our conversation, which I knew we would. I knew I would, and obviously, I think you already know that I have missed these dearly. But, but,
As have I.
but that said, as we get ready to close here, man, like any like tips, suggestions, or just things you want to reiterate based off of our discussion today.
Yeah, the biggest thing I would say is take stock of your situation. Take inventory, because there's not just one way to do this, but also like the game's landscape is a very complicated one, and right now it's in a very tumultuous position.
Yeah.
And so if you can, you know, take the passion that you have for it and apply it in a way that doesn't necessarily have to put like, your livelihood at risk, for example, then I say you do that. I think if you have some of the safety nets necessary to be able to take bigger risk, then maybe that's worthwhile. But, I think we're really all in it for the love of the game and the experience, right? Like, so there's not just one way, it's all about whatever works best for you. But I think the self-awareness and the discipline, those are very important.
Excellent. I absolutely love those points there. And again, thank you so much for sharing all this. Hey,
It's my pleasure.
Mustapha, man, loved having you here and everything else. Of course, it's been a long time overdue. Glad that things sound like they're going great. But for anybody listening today that want to reach out, find out more, connect, please drop us some links, man.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm no longer on Twitter, but I can be found on LinkedIn just by my name, Mustapha Price, also featherfellowgames.com, as well as mustaphasgameroom.com. That second one is more blog style. I post personal essays, game reviews, that sort of thing. So, but yeah, feel free to reach out, and then I'll probably be opening Pandora's box pretty soon, so you'll probably be hearing a lot from me.
All right, awesome. I can't wait and everything else. And I'm always here to help you out, buddy. But again, thank you so much, folks. Check out those links. They will be available in the show notes. Mustapha, it has been an absolute treat getting you back here on the show. Glad things are going well.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustapha Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.